Hi there, it's Rachel Greig, and in today's video I'm going to show you how you can create a patchwork pattern using our hexagon stencil. So our hexagon stencil has the negative shape, as you can see here in the video, where it has the open hole of the stencil, and it also includes the mask. So it is that same hexagon shape, but it is the positive side, so it means you can also use the hexagon mask in a different way. But for this particular project, what I'm doing is creating a hexagon pattern, kind of like a patchwork quilt, using the open part of the hexagon stencil. And I've chosen 3 different distress inks, and I will add a 4th one as I go along using the patchwork design. And I've chosen these little distress inks here because I want to create a nice warm color palette. And the colours I'm starting with are crushed olive, scattered straw, and wild honey. And what I'm doing here with the hexagon stencil, I just started one of the shapes just hanging over the left-hand side of the page. That was with the crushed olive distress ink. And then you just move the hexagon stencil to the side. So each side of the hexagon is the same size, so you can just build up your pattern as you can see here on your page. Now I'm working in a Dilutions dialogue journal, so it's the same size as a traveler's notebook. And the Dilution dialogue journal has a really nice paper inside of it, very similar to the Dilutions journal. It's just a little bit thinner than the Dilutions journal, but you can still do lots of mixed media on these pages, and it works really, really well with distress inks and paint and lots of other mediums. So I'm still building up my pattern here, and I don't want the pattern to go over on the right hand side of that page or the second page there. So I've just put down a little post-it note. So that's just going to take the excess ink on that right hand side page, and then I just lift it off, and you can see there that I've just got the hexagon finishing in the spine or in the join of those pages. And you want to clean your stencil in between each one if you've got lots of ink still on there, because you don't want that darker ink to then rub off the stencil next time you're using a lighter color. So whenever I'm using that wild honey, I will go ahead and clean the stencil before I go back and change it to one of the lighter colors, which is this scattered straw. And that means that that wild honey is no longer around the stencil, around the edge, and I am just getting that lighter scattered straw color on the area that I want to stencil. So I've gone ahead and nearly completed my pattern here, and I'm just finishing off the page down the bottom. And what I'm using, if you've not seen the ink blending tool, this is a ink blending tool where it's got a piece of foam on the bottom of it, which can be removed and changed depending on what color you're using. And you can see the little round foams up there on the left hand part of the screen, and I've got a different color foam for each little mini ink pad that I have. So the Distress mini ink pads are like little 1-inch cubes, and the little foams just tuck underneath those ink pads when you're storing them. So it makes it really easy to store, and it's also really easy to have a particular foam for every color if you're able to. Otherwise, what you can do is just use a foam for the same color family. So if you've got like greens, then you could have one foam that does the greens. It just depends on, if you're using a darker green, it may just be more difficult to go and use a lighter color of green, but you can give them a little wash, and it'll just give out, or it'll just remove any of that excess ink or paint that you're using, and then you can reuse it then with the new color. So I've almost finished my pattern here, and I'm just again putting down a post-it note just to make sure that I don't go on that right hand side there, and just sponging in a little bit of that ink. And now my pattern's complete, and what I want to do now is start adding some designs inside. So I want to mask off every single hexagon. So I'm going to be creating a nice sort of like garden theme for this background. So I'm using the Ferns stencil, but I don't want the fern to go into the other hexagons. I only want it to go in this particular one hexagon. So what I've done is I've put the main hexagon stencil underneath where that hexagon shape was, and then placing the fern stencil over the top. So that hexagon stencil underneath is actually going to mask that fern stencil. So the fern stencil will only go through where that open hexagon is. And when I place down the ferns, you can see there that I have It doesn't cover the hexagon shape completely, so I just put some post-it notes there around the edges of the fern to make sure that that also, like the edge of the fern stencil, I don't get ink over the edge of that fern stencil as well. So all I'm getting now is just the fern inside those little hexagon shapes. So the fern, what I'm doing is using a darker color. So this one here is the Forest Moss Distress Ink color, so it's a darker green, and rather than really sponging with that distress, the ink blending tool, what I'm doing is I'm just tapping and twisting. So that means then it's just a little light sponging with the ink going into that hexagon, and you're not really rubbing the stencil and then, you know, causing the stencil parts of those ferns or the flowers to lift up. And again, I've just gone ahead and done a few of these flowers. This is the Carved Flowers stencil, and this one here I'm using the Ripe Persimmon Distress Ink and just tapping and twisting, and just till I get that entire flower inside that hexagon shape. So I've used a few different stencils with the inside shapes here. I used the Lavender stencil for a couple of the hexagons and used different ferns with different colors. I used either crushed olive with the other little fern there that you can see in those hexagon shapes. And now I'm just using the Carved Flowers just in these, like the darker hexagons, which had the wild honey in the background. And then I'm just using the Ripe Persimmon just over the top with these Carved Flowers. So I'm just adding the little details here just around to the edges of those little edge hexagons, just using different flowers and ferns. And you can see here I'm just finishing off this one. This is the Lavender stencil, which is a really pretty little stencil. And again, just using some different distress inks just to add those little details to the edges. And we have lots of different shape stencils that would work really well with this technique. I'm using it here inside the Dilutions dialogue, but you could use this same technique to do card fronts or to make art journal pages, anything that you like. And you can see there that I've actually left one of the hexagons open with no flower or fern. And what I want to do is create a quote inside of that. So I've got out the Botanical script stamp set, and I'm just going to stamp one of the sentiments from that stamp set inside that little hexagon. And that's a nice little quote that goes really nicely with all the ferns and the flowers. We have quite a few other shape stencils in our range. We've got squares, circles, ovals, rectangles, hearts and diamonds. And a lot of those would work really well using this technique as well. So especially something like the diamond, which could be created as a patchwork like this. But with a lot of the other shapes as well, you can create your own patterns and overlap them and use them to do this highlight stenciling, like the masking stencil technique, where you can use little ferns or other images inside those shapes. We've also got some Christmas ones, which are stars and reindeers, baubles and Christmas tree. And then we've also got something relating to the sky. So we've got weather ones like clouds and the sun and the moon. And what I'm doing now is I'm just finishing off the little hexagons. I've just got a little an Inkjoy pen. So this is just a little black gel pen, and I'm just tracing around the edges using the hexagon stencil as a guide, and then just drawing around neatly and then doing it a little bit scribbly so it does look like it's all hand drawn. And it just gives the hexagon just a nice little edge of the shapes. And once you've finished tracing around all of the hexagons with the pen, then your page is finished. So I hope you enjoyed this technique. It is a nice little way to use the hexagon stencil and any of your other shape stencils. And you can mix and match depending on what stencils you'd like to mask with and what you'd want to put inside. And you can create all sorts of different themed pages and cards. You can find all of our small stencils on our website at darkroomdoor.com or ask for them at your favourite retailer. Thanks so much for watching.